Assalamualaikum. I wanted to build on what Margari focused on around how the community can support Muslim women and spend a little bit of time talking about how Muslim women can build themselves up and what it takes. It's funny what Muslim Women's Alliance put in the notes was 2019 has been a year for you. And I was like, okay, so let's do a little bit of an overview of what happened before I dive into what the lessons are. Some of you may be familiar with the controversy around the Women's March. At the end of 2016, when then candidate Trump had been elected, the Women's March came together. Our sister Linda and a number of other really great activists came to the helm of a newly forming organization. And what they did in 2017 was give people like us who were afraid, who were concerned, who felt paralyzed. And I say that recognizing that even I, in my position as a CAIR director, felt those things. They gave us an outlet, they gave us an opportunity. And so I was honored to speak at the 2017 Women's March in DC, and then in 2018 and 2019 at local women's marches. I stayed in touch with the organization. And then in 2019, the founders decided to take a step back and create a new board. And so there was a whole process. There was a nominations committee, a selection process, an application procedure. I was recruited to apply to the new board. And I joined the new board in July of 2019. It was one founder who had stayed on and 16 new women. All we did between July and September was coordinate the transition announcement. That was literally all that this new group had accomplished, myself included. We were so stifled by the concern about what the right wing would do and how it would go over and what would be said. And so in mid-September, it was like a Monday morning in mid-September, we broke the news to the world about the new board through an exclusive in the Washington Post. And the headline in the Washington Post first and foremost smeared the founders. It said that the Women's March was cutting ties with them, when in fact the Women's March was not cutting ties with them. They were transitioning, they were still advising. It was actually an outright lie. Like, it's very rare that you'll see, like a lot of times we'll see headlines that are offensive, but it's a different thing to see something that is an outright lie and be so connected to the work and be like, wait, this doesn't make any sense. Well, the right wing immediately seized on it. And the story became, the right wing story became out with the anti-Semites, in with the Islamist. And I was the Islamist for my connections to CAIR, for my critique of apartheid Israel, and so on. And in less time than we had spent on the board together, the new board voted me off the board. It's a matter of 48 hours between Monday afternoon and Wednesday night. And sometimes 2 days can feel like 2 days, and sometimes 2 days can feel like 2 years. Like, I could probably account for every hour in that 2 days, from the first phone call where it's like, hey, this is becoming an issue. And I explained, actually, this happens to Muslim women all the time. It's not going to be a national issue unless you make it a national issue. This is how we proceed. This is my experience. This is my family's experience. This is our organization's experience. To the next call where there's a conversation about like, well, what if you resign, right? And it was like, well, why would I resign? I haven't done anything wrong. Well, what if you resign and we replace you with another Muslim leader? And, to the point about Muslim women being able to hold each other up, I was able to say with great confidence, like, if you seek out another Muslim woman leader in this context, I can assure you that no one I'm friends with is going to step into this vacancy at this moment. And then the conversation, continues to, well, how will we ever talk about reproductive rights if we're always talking about Palestine? Which is the classic, like, progressive accept Palestine line in feminist circles, to which the response is, and should continue to be, why can't we do both, right? Well, what about our reputations? Well, why did you come into such a controversial organization to begin with? Like, I knew what I was putting on the line coming into the Women's March, but if you thought that your company or your career weren't going to take a hit for you coming into a very controversial organization, one that has been attacked by the president's son and Fox News itself for 3 years, and what were you getting into? And so this new board of women, in about 2.5 days, right? So the old board sustained 2.5 years of attacks. The new board in 2.5 days caved. And our arguments to them were a few things. One, it wasn't a unanimous vote. It was a majority vote. It was done over the objection of every single co-founder. And what we said to them was, even if, right, let's say we were to concede that I had done something wrong, which I wasn't willing to concede. Even if we were to concede that, you don't cave to right-wing pressure, right? Because it shows them, I mean, any parent will tell you is that if your kid throws a tantrum and you give them exactly what they want, then they're just gonna keep throwing tantrums. And that's how they know that they win, right? So that was our first concern. Our second concern was that for so long, Muslim women had found a place in the Women's March, that we looked to the leadership, the founding leaders of the Women's March, and we said, we belong here. MWA took a contingent multiple years in a row to the marches in DC. And I remember seeing them when I was speaking in 2017 and just being so amazed that these women came all the way from Chicago. And all of a sudden, they're gonna look at this organization and say, oh, you only like Muslim women if they're palatable. You only like Muslim women if they voice their support for Palestine gently. We can't offend the Israelis. We can't offend the Zionists. And it's funny because when we're having conversations about police violence, right? Like in interfaith spaces, there are some rules, and I don't think that, and Marjorie, like I don't wanna, you should tell me if I'm wrong about this. But as I understand it, when I'm working with white allies in interfaith spaces, there is some understanding now in 2019 that we can't tell Black communities how to express their rage, right? And I don't think it's perfect, but it's like a learning curve, right? Mm-hmm. People are doing that. But for some reason, when it comes to Israel-Palestine, we want to tell Palestinians and Muslims and others how to express their rage, what forms of rage are acceptable. So Wednesday, September 18th, I get voted off the board, and then it's done. People asked how I got through, and what was interesting and what was, I think, really an opportunity for me to learn was like the practice of being tested. Because I acknowledge that I am an activist, but I'm a comfortable activist. I'm a US citizen. Most days I have a voice. I speak English. I have a roof over my head. I know where my next meal is coming from. And yes, I live in a very secure situation where people don't know where I live and there's cameras and locks and all these things, but I don't generally fear for my safety. And I have a supportive family. So when I go around telling people, like, we have to take risks, we have to be courageous, right? We have to really push ourselves. Sometimes I too have to be pushed. And so that was the first part of the lessons for me, right? Is that I too will be tested. Who do you think you are to say that you believe and won't be tested? You will be tested. And our tests will look different. For those of us with certain types of privilege, we'll be tested in certain ways. For those of us with different types of privilege, we'll be tested in other ways. So that was the first thing, is to just accept that this is my test. The second lesson for me was in submitting, was in choosing to submit, right? This has come. Allah has decreed what will happen. I need to work towards an outcome and accept that I can't control the outcome. Right? And so I can control what I control. I can't control what anyone else does. There's something really powerful about that. I remember one of my colleagues, he texted me, he said, you may love a thing and it is bad for you. And you may hate a thing and it is good for you. And I was talking to him about it and I said, the funny thing about truly accepting that is that then you don't hate that thing. I remember years ago when I was going through my divorce, I was thinking that there was a best case scenario and a worst case scenario. Best case scenario, the marriage works out, we stay together. Worst case scenario, there's a divorce. With time and space, I can now say that there was no worst case scenario, right? It didn't work out and that was what was decreed. And so when we truly submit, you can accept that there are no worst case scenarios. I tell students that, when you take an exam in college, particularly in law school, which is miserable, but you should go if you want to be a lawyer. Please, we need more Muslim lawyers. The exams are graded on a curve, which means some people have to fail. But when Allah gives you a test, He doesn't give you more than you can handle. And He gives you what is good for you. And maybe you don't see it right away. But there's something just, for me, really incredible about surrendering to that. To being like, okay, I have to try. I have to study. I have to do the work. We called every single board member, right? The founders called every board member. I called every board member. We counted votes. We did it up until the last minute. And then when we thought, hey, we're going to lose this vote, we wrote our statement. I had my statement ready to go. But you do the work and then you submit. It's important through all of this that we have a spiritual practice, right? And by that, I literally mean that we be following the 5 pillars. I can't tell you how many people miss prayers because they're at a protest, right? Or I stayed up all night on that conference call, so I missed Fajr, right? And that happens, by the way, at conferences like this, right? If you are not in bed by 12:30 a.m., you should just stay up until Fajr. Just stay up. People ask, how do you sustain, right? You sustain by doing those things, by making sure that you are praying 5 times a day, by making sure that you are fasting, by making sure that you are paying charity, but also that you're like respectful to your parents. I have a reminder on my phone that says, call your parents. Because sometimes I return the calls for work and I return the calls for the conference, but I forget to call my parents, right? And calling my parents may feel like a chore, but it is also a spiritual practice. It is also part of how I embody my faith. And so make sure that you've got that and that you've got that on lock. Specifically here, while we're at Mass, it's important that, that I make note of the fact that I credit a lot of my spiritual practice to being in a Mass halakha or in an usra. And I've been in one, I think, since 2007, so before I started at CAIR. And some days I don't want to go. Like, I honestly don't want to read the homework. I don't want to see the people. I really just want to go home after work and go to sleep. But I drag myself to the practice. Sometimes I go willingly. Sometimes I drag myself, right? But having that method of accountability, right? Someone who says, hey, what are your goals? Okay, that's great. You organized a protest. You had a successful fundraising event. But when was the last time you read the Quran, right? And are you reading it regularly? Don't neglect those things. And when you see people who are on the front lines, know that the ones that I look up to have a practice, and it's an ongoing process. It's not a destination, it's a journey. Have a good circle of friends. So full disclosure, I don't cook, I'm terrible, I bake, right? But I have a good circle of friends who not only says like, hey, how often are you reading the Quran? How much are you reading? Like, what is your accountability? Another thing that I recommend very specifically beyond a Mass Usra is an app called Habit Share. It's an app where you can set in your habits and then you pick which friends you're sharing them with. So your friends can see, right? So we had a goal recently to read Quran every day for 40 days straight. Could be 5 minutes, it could be 15 minutes, but to not skip a day. And I did it with a circle of friends who could check in and see like, hey, did she mark today off, right? Did she mark today off? Because if I'm just holding myself accountable, let's be real, that's not actual accountability. I do that for the gym too. Like, did I go to the gym 3 times this week? I didn't go to the gym 3 times this week, but last week I got in a lot of workouts. So do those things. Have a good circle of friends. The reason I made the cooking joke is because they also make sure I eat, right? Like, did you eat your vegetables? No, the vegetables on the pizza do not count as your vegetable intake, right? Ask for help. So when I was going through what I went through with the Women's March, use like this very microcosm of an example, I wrote a statement. But like, have you ever written a letter when you're angry? Don't send that letter. Like, have 5 people proofread it, sleep on it, have another 5 people proofread it. Here I am. I've been a lawyer for 10 years. This wasn't my first PR crisis, right? I work at an organization that deals in PR crises. I wrote a statement and then I asked people for help. I said, can you read this? Can you double check this? Does this sound okay? How will this land, right? How do we word this? What about this? What about this? What about this, right? So ask for help. People won't know how to help you unless you're asking. Have you ever had a friend and you're like, I really want to help her. I don't know what she needs, right? And so you send her flowers, and that's great. Send her flowers. People sent flowers. That is a really great thing you can and should do for people. Send candy, send ice cream, right? But if you're on the end of the equation, where you're the one that needs help, the more specific you can be in asking for it, the more able people will be to help you. Otherwise, they're just guessing. All of those people that I asked for help that week wouldn't have known that I needed help with a statement, that I needed help with a connection, that I needed someone to talk to someone who would say something. The last 2 things I'll say as I wrap up are to care for your physical health. And I say that as someone who has been sick for a week and has only taken 1 day to sleep, and I'm going to go to my room after this to just sleep until my sessions tomorrow, right? But care for your physical health. Your health is a trust from Allah, right? That means you go to the gym. It means you eat healthy. It means that you sleep well and that you do those things intentionally. When you look at your leaders, your speakers, your activists, right? Know that the work that they're doing often takes a toll on their physical health. And so then they engage in practices to do better. There's a reason my friends hold me accountable around going to the gym, because they know that come 2020, I'm going to need to be at my best physical condition, right? So care for your physical health. And then the last thing is to care for your mental health. I try never to leave a session about well-being and activism and caring for each other without mentioning that. I've been going to a therapist for three or 4 years, right? I go monthly, I unload, it's a confidential session. I know that if she breaks confidentiality, I will sue her for her license. It is the safest conversation you can have. You know what? Because when I talk to my mom, she gets worried. When I talk to my friends, like they have their own burdens. When I talk to a partner or someone in a relationship, I worry about what happens, like how they perceive me, right? When I talk to a therapist, it's non-judgmental, it's confidential, it's culturally competent, right? It's all of those things. And you don't, my dad gave me a 2000 Toyota Camry when I was 17. Some of you have heard me talk about mental health, have heard me say this before. My mom had it for a year. I think she put like 8,000 miles on it in a year, which is great. That is exactly how many you should put in 1 year. I think I put like 15 to 20,000 miles a year on it for the next few years. I gave it up in 2016. It had 330,000 miles on it. You do the math, right? And the way it got that far is because it went in for regular oil changes, tire rotations, like the brakes got checked. My dad's a mechanic, so many times he would do that himself. But if he wasn't there, once I moved away, he would call and call and call. One time he found out which mechanic I was taking the car to on Yelp. And he called the mechanic and he talked to him in Urdu to vet him. And I was so embarrassed when I got to the auto body shop because the guy was like, oh, I talked to your dad today. And I was like, how did my dad find you? The car survived, right? 16 years with me and 300,000 miles because it got those regular checkups. And that means I didn't just take it in when it was broken, right? So yes, there is the day when you're looking in the mirror and you're like, I can't imagine tomorrow. And you're like, I might hurt myself. Right? You absolutely go to a therapist that day, right? You call the emergency line that day. But there are also lots of days where you're just tired or you're like, sometimes I go to the therapist and I'm like, I have nothing to talk about. And an hour later, I'm like, oh, I'm still talking, right? So do those things to care for yourself. I'm going to stop talking now because even without a voice, I can blab and blab and blab. And that's why they sent me to law school. So submit, right? Submit to Allah's will. Accept that what comes your way comes from Him. And Him alone, and He controls the outcome. What you control is what you do. Make sure that you have a regular spiritual practice, right? That means you fulfill your religious obligations first and foremost. If you are at the protest and not at prayer, right? If you are in the convention hall lobby tonight and not at Fajr, and Fajr in your room, that's fine. I'm not trying to say you have to come down for Jama'ah, like unless you're a man, in which case maybe you should consider it. But do your spiritual practice, right? Have a good circle of friends. Ask for help. Care for your physical health and also care for your mental health. Jazakallah khair.